Lead balloons.
Lead balloons.
The alchemy of unpopular opinions.
Unpopular opinions.
Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off.
And I know that you're out to get the ladies.
We're not encouraged to think critically.
Life is hard. It's supposed to be hard.
Oh my gosh. That's hilarious. Busted.
Oh, hello everyone. Welcome to our podcast, Lead Balloons, the alchemy of unpopular opinions. My name is Joel. I'm here in Dallas, Texas.
Yeah, and my name is Trent, and I'm here in Lakewood, Colorado. Yes.
You're feeling, how you feeling today, Trent?
A little spicy. Yeah, I feel a little spicy today, so all bets are off. Who knows what will happen? I like it. Yeah.
Bring on the unscripted rants and just railing against the machine.
Someone has a case of the Mondays. That is me. Me. So
I love it.
Yeah.
So our topic for today is atheism is so hot right now, so hot. And I wanted to kind of like start this off with a little bit of a conversation. We're going to be delving into your story, Trent, kind of your path of how this Jesus-loving white boy from Missouri like turned the bow of his boat towards Beelzebub and became what we would call an atheist. I know that most people say atheists have a qualification. Would you agree that like to say atheist is sometimes a very broad kind of way to paint someone's beliefs?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a useful term, and I think that it definitely has a place. But yeah, it has some nuance for sure. Yeah.
Cool. All right. So when you someone asks you today if you would describe how you would describe yourself spiritually, what do you say? What is the kind of the shortest way for you to describe and maybe catch some of the nuance?
Yeah, well, if somebody asked me how to describe myself spiritually, I probably would say that in some ways I'm spiritual, depending on what you mean. But I'm still interested in transcendent things. I'm still interested in becoming a better version of myself. I'm still interested in the big questions of life. So I don't have a problem with that question. If somebody narrows it down in another way, then I will, then we have a different conversation. But yeah, if somebody asks me how to describe myself spiritually, I don't think that I would say that I'm unspiritual.
Sure.
I don't have any strong conviction about what's out there beyond the stars or in the other dimensions. So yeah.
That makes sense. So you're comfortable with saying atheist is an accurate label for you?
Yeah, I think so. But the problem is I never know what exactly people are talking about when they hear the word atheist or what they mean when they say the word atheist. Because, for example, nobody uses the word deist, but deist would be probably a way of describing that you don't believe that there is any sort of divine energy or force that's responsible for the instigation of the universe, the Big Bang, and so on and so forth. When I say so, I wouldn't describe myself as deist. I think that there could be a higher power out there. It's possible. When I use if I use the term atheist to describe myself, I would be using it to say that all the arguments that I have heard advanced in support of a God who not only exists but also can be known, intervenes in our life, sets up rules and guidelines, rewards and punishments, and has communicated through human beings to tell us what those things are, vis-a-vis the Bible and so forth, then I would say I would disagree that there's evidence to support those things. I don't have any issue with people feeling like they believe in a higher power and so forth, but it's when they want to get more specific and say, I know exactly who God is, or I have a very good idea of who he is, and basically when like the God of the Bible, the God of the Quran, the God of the Mormonism, the God of these are gods that I would say I don't believe in. So to that extent, I'm happy to use the term atheist. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. As a pastor, a lot of times I would have conversations with people who said they were atheists, and it was like, well, I would, just to kind of keep the conversation going, I would say, well, please tell me about this God you don't believe in, because it's likely I don't either. And so there's obviously so much room between like, what does that mean in terms of spirituality? So, we're gonna have time to kind of get into this journey. But
sure.
My kind of foray into atheism came via listening to some mostly Christians debating the views of Friedrich Nietzsche, existential philosopher, and kind of really put atheism, at least in my mind, on the map of Western kind of thinking in some very prominent ways. And I want to read a quote to you. This is from the Madman and the Gay Science that he wrote. I think there's also a similar quote in Thus Spoke Zarathustra. But what I want you to do, I want to get your reaction to this. But I don't want Trent today's thoughts. I want, what does Trent in his 20s think? You know what I mean? Like, how would Trent, who is, still filling out the chest hair, still, like, how does young Trent, how does he respond to this? So here it is. This is a bit of a long quote, but let me read it for everyone. This is Friedrich Nietzsche, in this, it's a kind of a parable that he wrote, and his character, the madman, says, God is dead. God remains dead, and we have killed him. How shall we comfort ourselves, the murderer of all murderers? What was holiest and mightiest of all that the world has yet owned has bled to death under our knives? Who will wipe this blood off us? What water is there for us to clean ourselves? What festivals of atonement? What sacred games shall we have to invent? Is not the greatness of this deed too great for us? Must we ourselves not become gods simply to appear worthy of it?
So you want me to try to ventriloquize 25-year-old Trent is what you're asking for?
Yes.
For a tall task. Okay, so me at 25,
Bring him to life for us.
I would say something like, well, Joel, well written, Nietzsche, very gifted author. The thing that I think I would say about that is I don't believe that whatever he says, I don't believe that you could actually kill God. God's not capable of being killed. To the extent that he thinks that God has been sort of metaphorically killed in the culture, maybe that to that extent is true, but God is just as alive as ever. He's fulfilling his purposes. He's carrying out his plan. Whether or not human beings come along with that, he is going to be alive, and he'll reveal himself to those who are chosen, Joel. The Spirit will move and compel those who truly belong to him. And so there doesn't matter what Nietzsche or any other atheist think. God is going to do what God is going to do. And so, this compelling quote, all these kinds of things. But to the extent that a culture has gotten rid of God, it has committed a fatal error. But it's to be expected. That's the vast majority of people do reject God. Is that good?
All right.
Is that good?
Yeah. I hear the diplomacy, right? You want to make sure to honor the writings of this intellectual, but also just like, just you don't get it, and I'm sorry that you don't.
Yeah, that's right. It's to be expected.
Yeah, that goes back to one of our other conversations about Calvin's God being a dick, because that's kind of how Calvin saw things. Like, people are supposed to reject God because we're so awful, and those who are chosen will get a chance to see the light. Pay for us, for everyone. Let's go back, and we're gonna lay out this path, because I do think that there's some people who either will resonate with your story or they'll resonate with parts of your story in terms of what you wrestled with along the way. You didn't get from there to here today in just one, little like flip of a switch, right? It was a long unfolding journey. So help us, looking back, give me a picture. How conservative were you?
Yeah, Joel. I mean, I think politically is one thing. I won't delve into that, but theologically, I was quite conservative. I was really interested for quite a number of years of my life in really knowing exactly what the Bible taught, and just like, whatever the Bible says, I want to do that thing. I want to believe that thing, and I didn't want to go outside of that. I wasn't open to liberal interpretations of the Bible or anything like that. But so I was a true believer, Joel. I was the guy who, even though I was really scared to evangelize, I wanted to evangelize, and I tried to evangelize. I tried to read my Bible. I tried to be in church. I tried to avoid the things that you're supposed to avoid, sex, drugs, and alcohol. I tried not to watch bad movies. I tried to be sort of the best Christian that I could be. And so I took all the warnings seriously, the rewards, the punishments, all that I internalized big time. But I will say that I don't think there was ever a time, at least when I got into my mid to late teens, and from that point forward, there was never a time when I wasn't interested in asking hard questions. Now, I didn't always want to go there, but those questions were always there. One of the first questions that I asked, I think I was 16 or 17 years old, and I asked one of the youth sponsors, who was a pretty bright guy, I had a question about the canon of Scripture. I don't know what prompted this, but I asked him, I said, well, the Bible has 66 books. Who decided what got to be part of the Bible and what was left out? That process, that was for a real hang-up for me, and I'm not sure why, but it was a real hang-up. And so I had questions like that. And then not long after that, started having questions about, were Adam and Eve real human beings? Was the earth created in 6 days? Is the earth 6,000 years old? These kinds of things. So I had real questions, and I had sympathy for people who also had those questions. So I don't think that I was the type of conservative who was so dogmatic that I wasn't willing to entertain those conversations. I think that when I had those doubts rise up in me, I would usually try to drink a heavy dose of that reassurance of faith. That faith is the evidence of things unseen, and that it's supposed to be weird. You're supposed to have doubts. You're supposed to not be sure about things. That's kind of the way that it's supposed to be. So that's how I dealt with a lot of those questions. They were there, but I was able to sort of ward them off by the promises of Scripture as well as other believers.
I resonate with that and relate to that as well. Always have been very curious and committed to having intellectual integrity, like having consistency in terms of how things are kind of like, hey, this is like, it always drove me bananas, even in my most conservative of times, to be like, okay, there's this passage in Paul in Romans where he talks about, like, people who don't know God in the end, they have no excuse, because look at the heavens, right? Look at the heavens. They declare God's glory, so they are without excuse. However, it always drove me nuts that the only way to get saved was not through, God revealing himself through nature. You had to know Jesus Christ, right? And you had to say a certain prayer. So God, you have to be saved through this very explicit way, but you can be condemned to hell for eternity because you didn't catch the implicit message in the sky of stars and all that. It always drove me bananas that this completely unfair process of what salvation was supposed to look like, and it had eternal consequences for people. So I've always found that there's cracks in the container, that everyone's given a container, in my view, that we grow up in, and that's just part of what it means to be a human being and part of this human experience. And for
Yes.
me, those cracks were intellectual, those intellectual inconsistencies, but sometimes they're experiential. Sometimes it's like feeling betrayed from a trusted individual in our lives. It may be a parent or pastor or a coach or a teacher, or it may just be a very a difficult experience of shame or something painful. There's so many different stories I've heard of why people have really veered away from institutional religion. I'm curious, what were your cracks? What were the cracks in your container that began to grow and fully open up this box that you were living in?
Yeah. Well, I think it's a really good question, Joel, and I think you've prefaced it well too. I would say that it's very important for people to understand that we all come from a context. We all come from a specific place where certain things happen, and that we are indivisible from the things that have influenced us from our earliest years onward. So those things are undeniable, and they do shape where we end up as people. So I would say two things. One is I would probably not have gotten to, my guess is that I probably would not have gotten to a place where I was deeply questioning my faith had I not had certain experiences, right? There were certain frustrations that I had, as well as just conversations that I had with Christians and non-Christians that opened the door for me to start asking questions. But I did have a lot of frustrations in church. And so what I say to people when people want to know my story is I had a lot of bad experiences in church, and I had a lot of wonderful experiences.
Sure.
So
yeah.
I didn't come to a place where I was just like, I'm fed up with Christianity. It's not working for me. God's not working for me, and I'm done. I think a lot of people hear about me or hear me tell my story, and they're like, yeah. Okay, all that stuff that you're saying about this not being true, that not being true, that's fine. What we really know is that you had a bad experience with the pastor, right? Very patronizingly and condescendingly they say that. Listen, and I won't deny that I've had some eye-opening experiences that have definitely shaped me. But then the second part of what I want to say is it's those painful experiences that sort of gave me maybe more of an opportunity to expand some of the intellectual pursuits that I previously had held at bay. And so once I went into really pursuing those questions, and it really happened in earnest towards the end of my seminary career when I was at Fuller Seminary, where I really dug into these questions. And yes, some of it was driven by real frustration with the things that I had experienced, but that drove me towards those questions. And ultimately, I came out on the other side really not able to believe. Whereas previously I'd been able to believe, I came out on the other side not able to believe. And I was not, I don't know that I had an anger towards God or an anger towards the church. I didn't believe anymore. And so I think that's how I would answer that question. Those are the cracks I had. I think I'll say this and then I'll finish. I think there are a lot of people out there who are Christians. I know Christians who are devout to one degree or another who have a lot of the same questions that I had and have, but Christianity more or less works for their life. They might have a wife and kids and they're raising them with Christian values, or they belong to a community where they fit in there. And for them to pursue these questions and to maybe even ultimately end up as let's say an atheist or agnostic would be so catastrophic and so destabilizing that it's just not even conceivable. Look, I don't have a wife and kids, and I have a little bit more ability to, and it was still very painful, very destabilizing, and I'm still spinning in some ways, trying to figure out where I belong. It is not an easy journey, and that's I think why a lot of people don't go down that road.
Of course, I thanks for saying that, because as someone who is paid to have pastor people in a certain direction, my livelihood was tied. So even I was at a very unique church where I was able to create space by inviting in these kinds of questions. And so in some sense, the church was able to, like, I was helped to lead it evolve. It evolved a bit as I was evolving, but I was always like evolving like way faster than this community was. And it wasn't until I went through that extraordinarily painful experience of losing that kind of calling, so to speak, vocation of pastoring there, and that coming to an end, that painful experience of seeing kind of all the things going through a divorce and seeing how the community all has certain feelings about that disappointment. It's almost like the way I heard you kind of say is like having those negative experiences somehow give you permission to lean more into those questions, to go like, maybe I'm already losing these other things. I might as well go ahead and be authentic with these feelings I've been having. Now, I would not classify myself as an atheist, but I would definitely say that since I've stopped being a pastor and am no longer connected to a paycheck and the opinions of a whole community that I relied so heavily on for my own quality of life, I no longer have that. Now I have this open field to really kind of think about and feel about, and my beliefs are no longer tethered like Velcro to these other things. So I don't know if that resonates with you.
If I can chime in, because I just tell the audience that you introduced me to a book called The Myth of Certainty back right around the end of college, shortly after college, and so you were already sort of in that space. Mm-hmm. You were as long as I've known you, you've been in a sincere but undogmatic space, and I admire you because there's a phrase that goes, you probably heard this, but it's hard to get people to understand something when they're paid not to understand it. So pastors are not there to incite questioning and curiosity. They're mostly there to reinforce doctrine. You carved out a niche there at your church, your former church, where, of course, you were teaching things and reinforcing things, but you were carving out a space in which questions were encouraged and the intellectual pursuit of truth was encouraged. I'll tell a quick story. One of the experiences that I had in church that was very frustrating, I was tasked with like teaching some Sunday school classes to, I think it was adult Sundays. I may have told you this story before, but we were going through a certain doctrinal statement, a historic doctrinal statement. It said a lot of things that I agreed with at the time, and there were some things that I didn't agree with at all. Sure. And so I was supposed to teach it, but I remember talking to my pastor. I said, "Listen, I'm happy to present this material, but it's going to be more dialectical. It's going to be more interrogative rather than dogmatic and didactic." And he said, "Well, this is our doctrinal statement. We just need to teach it to people so that they know it, and we need to reinforce it." Basically, more or less telling me, like, my interpretation was, we need to indoctrinate these people. Yeah. And I thought to myself, okay, so you and I, Pastor, are on a very different trajectory. I'm interested in truth, wherever that may lead, however uncomfortable it may be. And if that means upsetting some of the people in the pews, and then they leave, or we lose our status because we don't believe it, I just can't do anything other than that. You can stay here, feed your family, and keep reinforcing this doctrine that people don't have enough time to study and look into, or you can encourage a healthy adult discussion about what are the pros and cons of these doctrinal points. And I was basically told to shut up and dance. And I'm like, well, find somebody else, because I'm an adult. I have some intelligence and some training, and I'm not wired that way. So I'm going to go on my own way, and you can stay here and believe the same things 50 years from now and tell everybody how much you've matured and grown as a human being and believe in the same exact things. I can't relate to it. For those who can, help yourself. Yeah,
I totally relate. Oh, I've been basically told to shut up and dance a couple times, when I was a youth pastor, for sure. It was
I don't understand how people, Joel, can say that and go to sleep at night feeling good about themselves and human beings. We all have to make compromises, but basically to tell yourself and tell other people, we're not going to seek truth. We're going to seek comfortability. Screw you, man.
Yeah. They're just trying to protect the homeostasis, right, of this organism. But the problem is, like, you're telling people that it is our job to give you the truth. And behind the scenes, that is not the motivation at all. And so there's a real, like, I always just found it's just a lack of integrity that is either unconsciously happening, and it's a blind spot. And it's a blind spot for a lot of people who are in religious world, but sometimes it's consciously done. They're like, and there's just people up there, pastors up there who know fully well, I don't believe this, but I am trying to keep this like hamster wheel you going. Yeah. You mentioned, I want to go back to something you had talked about. Like, you talked about the painful journey that this has been, even though you didn't have, like, you didn't lose, so to speak, this destabilizing of a family or getting paid money that your kids or whatever, all these things, but it was still painful. And I'm wondering if you can kind of share a little bit with us about this sort of coming out. Like, what does it look like for you? A lot of people know Trent. You're Trent who went to seminary. You're Trent who's giving his life to the ministry. These kinds of things. What is it like when you were having to like tell people that you cared about how things had changed for you?
Yeah. Well, I shared my deconversion with quite a few people, friends and family. And part of the hard process is you almost feel like when it happens, you feel like you're going to have to tell them eventually. And so then you realize, well, I need to probably just tell them now. And so you get to it sort of as soon as you can. That was the feeling that I had. I was met with some positive, what I perceived as positive reactions, as best as you could react. And I was met with some very negative reactions. A lot of people want to ask questions. Some people wanted to engage in debates. Some people didn't really want to know much about it, and then later on they wanted to sort of share their frustrations with me. I don't know. I don't think that I immediately lost friendships, but friendships were changed. Relationships had a different character. I remember I had one friend who lamented that I was trying to have a really good friendship with him and thought that we had a tight bond and stuff. And he shared with me on a message, like a text message, that he was frustrated that he couldn't pray with me anymore. He was frustrated that that we couldn't like share that spiritual bond. Because I had just said something like, I was like, so thankful you're my friend. I feel like I really appreciate you. And then he came back like I wish that we could still have that old bond that we used to have. It feels like something's missing. And I was just like, man, that hurts, because I feel like I'm still trying to be a really good friend to you. I think the best responses that I got from people were when I expect that it's hard for people to hear, and I don't expect them not be somewhat frustrated. So I get some of that, but I think it was nice to just have people say, hey, I love you. I still want to be your friend. I'm still interested in you. That doesn't change anything. That was what I really wanted to hear, and what I did hear from quite a few people. Joel, the biggest thing was when people assumed that by me becoming, let's say, an atheist, that meant that I was becoming a bad person. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm reluctant to say atheist, because when you say it, when it was said before I became an atheist, it just hurt. Like, an atheist, that's a rigid, that's a arrogant, callous, unbelieving human being who probably burns babies and slaughters villages and stuff. It's like, no, you just had the worst image. And I wanted people to see my views have changed, but I'm still a great guy. I still want to do things for humanity. I still want to have a friendship with you. And when that was called into question in some ways, again, not across the board, but there were some of those moments where my character was impugned without a chance to really give me time and see what was really going to happen with Trent. I guess here, I'll wrap with this. The thing that I really wanted was that I didn't get was, listen, if you vehemently disagree with the journey that I've been on and it really bothers you, at the least could you try to give me some credit for pursuing truth, even if I didn't end up where you wanted me to. Say, Trent, listen, I wouldn't end up where you, like if a Christian were talking to me, say, hey, I wouldn't end up where you ended up. But I admire the fact that you had the courage to pursue the truth and to be honest about it, because
Yep.
it's not people Christians talk about, oh, I'm persecuted. It's like, try being an atheist for a few days, see how that works out in society.
Yeah.
And so I didn't get that, and that's fine. But it would have been nice to hear, like, friendship like I have with you and a few other people, where they're like, hey, you know, I don't land where you land, but I respect your journey and I respect the way that you're doing it. You know.
Yeah, it is so painful, some of that, Trent. And like when I had a pretty tight-knit community of 200 to 300 people, maybe 100 of those people really closely, like I saw as just like lifelong friends that I've been invited into such sacred spaces and intimate spaces in their lives. And when I was no longer the pastor, all of a sudden those relationship dynamics just shifted in a way. And I wrongly assumed that those relationships had tight enough bonds to continue. And what ended up happening is I just watched people just ghost, and they just go off, or some of them would do it quietly, others would do it quite angrily. Their disappointment was verbalized. And I realized, oh, that relationship that I thought was there was illusory. It's not real. They didn't even have a real relationship with me, Joel the human. I was an avatar to them. I was Joel the pastor, and it was something they were kind of looking at that wasn't actually me. So when that disappeared, the whole relationship just like turned to smoke. And that was, I totally get that experience, and it is so painful. And it made me remember a quote from, hopefully a book we'll go over sometime, because it was so impacting for me. It got me through my divorce, called The Four Agreements. And in the book, there's a line that says, if people try to change you, that means they don't like you.
Yes.
And as someone who's a recovering people pleaser, that was a very hard pill for me to swallow. It took me a while to just recognize, oh, I can let go of these relationships because they no longer serve me. And it was so sad to see the pruning that happened afterwards. And I'm sure you had a pruning as well. But here's kind of my question, from where you've gone through this path of like a much more, I would say, kind of like a stable field now. Like you're, most people know who you are, and there's just kind of an acceptance, and there's just kind of a comfortability now in your conversations. And I personally, while I no longer relate to any of my kind of fundamentalist roots, I kind of see myself still, as a mystic, and I would even say Christ-centered in a lot of my views, even though a lot of Christians might call me a heretic anyways, but whatever. My question is, holding what you believe now, how do you perceive people like me? People who still have an intellectual view of spirituality, and kind of holding on to some of this mysticism in ways that you don't really hold on to anymore. Like, what's your perceptions of people like me?
Well, you're somebody that I can have a really good conversation with. And I look at somebody like you. I know you well. And you and I can have a very honest conversation. And I think that you I think right before I sort of officially became an atheist and left the church and would have declared myself that, I was kind of in a position similar to you, where I still felt faith was very important to me, and I still believed that, hey, a lot of this could, like when I stopped believing the Bible was inerrant. Sure. I believe that it was full of errors and stuff. I still thought that it was sort of authoritative, or at least inspired and stuff. I kind of held on to that. I think that what I probably would see as somebody who holds on to faith, but would declare to anybody that these are things that I believe because they're a deep part of me. They're inexplicable in certain ways. They're mysterious in certain ways. So I wouldn't I think your experience is totally fine. I think so. There's a view that I read about in an anthropological book that talks about culture. That culture is not just the positive things that we that we produce, the mores and the values that guide architecture and art and language, and it's not just the positive things. Culture is actually also an act of refusal. So they find like people groups living, in Northwest California 1,000 years ago, whatever, and they're living really close to each other, but they have very different like work ethics and very different views. Are they going to take slaves or not take? One group's going to be slave owning, the other isn't. And it looks like in certain instances, people do things that are sort of like directly the opposite of the people who are closest to them. Hence, like Protestantism and Catholicism and so forth. Yeah. All the internecine family debates that get really heated for people who are so close. The reason I bring that up, I think my evolution as a character, as a person, and theologically, religiously speaking, is in some ways in explicit contrast and opposition to those who claim not just that they have faith, but that they know that what the Bible says is true. How they know for sure that, like, for instance, it's a good thing to circumcise your child, or that you shouldn't eat certain food on certain days, or that you shouldn't have sex with certain persons and in certain positions. All these kinds of things that they know for sure. And not only are these aren't just beliefs, Joel, that they're willing to hedge on and say, hey, this is something I believe, but I wouldn't be dogmatic. They're willing to legislate those things for you. They're willing to say to me and to you and everybody else, I know, not that I think or there could be or might be, I'm trying to investigate whether or not there is a place called hell. No, there is a hell. Yeah. And there is a heaven. And if you do behavior set A, you'll go to heaven. If you do behavior set B, you'll go to hell. And I know that, and I'm willing to tell you and your children and your society that I know these things. That's when I start having an issue, because grand claims require grand evidence. And I think that's what I respond to is people who say, or I have people say, I'll get into a debate with somebody, and let's say we'll talk about hell. And they're like, well, they'll say, I haven't done the research that you have. I don't have a master's degree in theology. And I'll be like, yeah, it shows. It does. Yeah. And one of the things that you might want to do is show some respect. Like if you're talking to an engineer and you haven't studied engineering, would you debate an engineer on sort of bridge dynamics? Probably wouldn't. But the people who know almost nothing about Scripture are quite willing to engage me and tell me that I'm wrong, that I don't believe in hell. They've never done a bit of research on this stuff, and they're quite willing to say, I know it's true, I believe it's true. This is the kind of idiocy that when wiped out, will help individuals and will help our society be a better place, not an apocalyptic, fire-bent society.
I love it. There have been so many people I've bit my tongue. I was like, yeah, it shows that you have not engaged in other points of view, at least considered them. Okay, so this whole journey, Trent, is fascinating to me. I have several other friends who have been on similar journeys, but yours in particular, as your journey has kind of like woven in and out with vocation, because obviously theology and all of this, often gets hitched onto like your job and ministry and what that looks like. Yeah. And, personally, I think religion in America is moving in a healthier direction. The fastest growing religious group are called the nuns, N-O-N-E-S, not the Catholic nuns, but those who would checkmark, ask the question, what's your religious affiliation? They checkbox, none, no affiliation. And I think that just kind of like almost as a society, we're starting to finally see the bullshit. And yet we're also not willing, it seems, to throw the baby out with the bathwater. And so there's this kind of like, what do we keep? What do we hold on to? The benefit of community, which is a valid thing. The benefit, one of the things that I deeply miss. And spirituality has always been kind of a catchword for everything we don't really understand. And so there's this spirituality that's kind of like morphing. And you had mentioned to me earlier before we hopped on this, that the title of this is that, atheism's so hot right now. And you said you kind of had some issues with that. Can you elaborate on that?
Yeah, because I think that, as you've just said, that the nuns, NONES, are the nuns category is like one of the fastest growing, if not the fastest growing category as a percentage in the country. So there's, compared to 50 years ago, a lot more people are identifying that way. So it's hot in that way.
Mm-hmm.
But it isn't hot in the sense that few people dare to publicly identify as atheist or agnostic, and we don't have hardly any elected officials who declare themselves as unaffiliated. So I think I heard something, I hope this is accurate, but something like, I don't know, like a handful of people in the House of Representatives declared themselves, probably from Vermont or somewhere,
Exactly.
Washington, declared themselves as unaffiliated. 5. So if the House of Representatives has 435, that's like a little over 1%, and yet nuns might be 25 to 30% of the population. How's that possible?
Yeah.
So what that tells me, at the very least, is there's still some great stigma attached to declaring yourself to be an atheist or to be agnostic. And one of the things I'll add to that, Joel, if I tell somebody I'm an atheist, I'm not really saying that much at all. I'm saying almost nothing. All I'm simply saying with that is the argument that you presented to you in general, people, you presented to me in support of the God that you believe in, I don't believe that. That's all I'm saying. It's not a system. It's not a worldview. Somebody could correct me on this, and if you want to correct back, you could. But I don't see it as a worldview. I don't see it as a system. There are atheists who fall into many different political categories, many different understandings of the world and worldviews and so forth. So you can't really pin somebody down, just like you can't pin somebody down who says they're a Christian. That could mean a ton of different things. But when I say I'm an atheist, you really don't know anything about me. And I've met many, many atheists who are very, very good people. So I would say it's a problematic, it's a weird situation right now in our country. It's going to be very interesting to see where it goes in the next 10 to 20 years, because Gen Z, millennials, very different, mapping out very different religiously than their parents and grandparents. It's going to be fascinating.
I know. I love it. It's the world my children are kind of growing up into, and it's creating this very interesting place for conversation with them. Okay, so I feel like we've talked through this journey. Hopefully, I'm sure more of this will happen throughout the future episodes. But to kind of wrap us up, I thought we'd close with something fun.
I thought you were going to say close in prayer. I was ready. I still have that muscle memory.
Bow your head, close your eyes. You know, if you were to die tonight, Trent.
Oh, no.
Oh, gosh. I just got like a little bit of a heebie-jeebie how many times I've done that.
That's
I've personally done that. Little bile in my mouth. I apologize. All right, so I want you to give an example from art, like movies, music, painting, whatever, that reflects your kind of attraction to atheism. And I wanted to share mine real quick. It's the movie The Grey with Liam Neeson in it. It's have you seen The Grey?
Yes.
It's such a good movie, and it's so dark and rich. And
you are going to die.
Yes, exactly. And so here's this character, spoiler alert. What's so interesting about it, here's this character who was contemplating suicide at the beginning of the movie for some personal reasons, but he's like out in the wilderness, and he, through various situations, ends up on this like expedition into the wilderness. It's like somewhere very cold, like Alaska or something like that. I don't remember exactly. And this group of men are being chased by wolves, and to the point where like his survival mechanisms start to kick in, and he's the last surviving guy at the end. And there's this real like theme with him and God, and the arguments that he had with other people in the group. And at the end, he's at this port where these wolves are coming in on him, and it's like he's just praying, God, help me. And there's this silence, nothing. And it's clear that, whatever is going to happen, there's not going to be any kind of intervention. And he just says kind of to himself, like, or to God, fuck it, I'm going to do it myself. And he like picks up like a limb and like, I'm going to fight these wolves. And to me, that scene represents so much of like the misperceptions that Christianity has given people about what's the purpose, the functionality of spirituality, as if like, this idea that God will just intervene and like save these people. And it's always like you and I grew up in kind of Pentecostal charismatic situations where people like get healed of cancer, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Where they get healed of all these different things. And these are testimonies. And I'm always like, would hear those even as like an 18-year-old be listening, go like, yeah, but what about all the other people who die of cancer? Like, why is God so amazing for helping this one person?
Yeah.
And that same God still amazing for letting everyone else just die alone. And it's like there was no integration. People just didn't have the ability to widen their view. And so like I watched that movie and I totally get where Liam Neeson's character's coming from, but I also totally think the God that didn't respond could still be there.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it's what you grabbed about that movie. It actually jives. This is kind of a fun coincidence because the book that I thought about was one that I read when I was in college, probably my junior or senior year I think the class was World Literature or Modern Literature with Dr. Epperson, who was one of my favorite professors and very wise, the late Dr. Epperson, who was a very wise man and actually probably had a tremendous influence on my life. But I read a book called Silence by Shusaku Endo. Have you read this book?
I know Saku Endo, but I've never read Silence.
Yeah. So it delves into a lot of those similar things. These like Portuguese missionaries go to Japan, and Japan is notorious for not having embraced Christianity. And they go and basically, instead of their message being accepted widely, their people are tortured to death and forced to recant. All these kinds of awful things happen, and the theme of God's silence runs throughout the book. Now, I read that book and was blown away, and because I resonated with that experience of not hearing from a God that you had been praying to, not having that conversation. I don't think that the logical result of reading that book is that you should give up faith, but I mention it because for a couple reasons. One, that it introduced me to asking the really hard questions, especially after having my own difficult experiences growing up and then the difficulties of college life and becoming a man, all these kinds of things. But I also point to it because that book was introduced by a professor Dr. Epperson, who was part of an English department that was kind of like a little renegade group there at ORU. They were all believers, but they tended to be more liberal and more open-minded, and they set me on that path of learning critical thinking skills, of learning how to think, of asking hard questions. I was introduced to literature that was difficult, that made me doubt a lot of things that I had known. It set me off on that journey, and then subsequently, I remember even at a conservative seminary in Kansas City, I had a professor there who was a brilliant guy and a really great teacher, and he said something. He said, never criticize something that you have not understood first, and you in order to understand something, you need to read it sympathetically. So it was these Christian figures at these universities and seminaries that actually gave me the toolkit not to become an atheist, but to ask the kinds of questions that led me down the road of the pursuit of truth that could have ended in a deeper faith, could also ended up in where I ended up with atheism. And those are the people that I admire. So you, in some ways, coming back to the question that you'd asked earlier, like what I think about people like you, I'm for anybody who is willing to ask the hard questions and have a good discussion and a hearty debate. The people who are against those kinds of discussions, want to shut down truth and preclude discussion, those are my enemies, is the way that I think of them. They're the enemy of culture and civilization and love and goodness and beauty. Those are the enemies of it. Those who are for the pursuit of truth are the people that I want to be a part of, you know?
Amen.
That's right, brother. That's right. Come.
All right. Well, hey, everyone. Thanks for joining us for this conversation. Really appreciate you guys coming along for our podcast, Lead Balloons, The Alchemy of Unpopular Opinions. Hope you will join us for future episodes. Thanks, Trent, so much for sharing your journey.
Thanks, buddy.